Titletown South Florida, brought to you by Orange Bowl. Since 1935, Orange Bowl's service and commitment to South Florida has been as diverse as the residents that live here. Over the past 2 decades, Orange Bowl and its partners have committed more than $40 million to improving the South Florida community through its Orange Bowl Cares initiative. To learn more, visit orangebowl.org. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Titletown South Florida, the Miami Herald's high school sports show, brought to you by Orange Bowl. I'm Andre Fernandez, Deputy Sports Editor at the Herald, flying solo this week because, once again, my co-pilots on the show are on the road. They're both on the West Coast. David Wilson covering the Florida Panthers out in the Stanley Cup final. Panthers, as of this recording, down 3-1, so we'll see if David has much left to cover on that season. And, of course, Jordan, the under-the-radar, surprising Miami Marlins as well, are out in Seattle. So shout out to both of them, as always, for their support and help on this show. But we'll get them back soon on a future episode. But for now, it's camp season in football. Last week, we wrapped up a little bit of the overall high school sports season, talking about our state champions and our winners there. This week, we're going to bring you the second part of my interview with Elite Scouting Services Coordinator Charles Fishbein, who broke down a bunch of the top offensive players in both Dade and Broward to look forward to as we head into the 2023 season. This week, we'll bring you the defensive segment as we dive into that side of the ball, talk a little bit about those guys and who has stood out the most. As I said before, it's camp season all around the country, with colleges hosting a lot of recruits right now. Obviously, this past weekend, one big one for South Florida guys was up in Tallahassee. Florida State hosting their showcase camps up there, the big mega camp that they do all the in recent years. Coach Mike Norvell and his staff, as always, doing a great job up there with the Seminoles and hosting hundreds of the top kids from around the country and other colleges as well, joining in and getting a chance to look at some of the best and most elite talent up there. Some of the notable names down here: JoJo Trader from Miami Central was up there, Zaquan Patterson from Chaminade, and many, many more. Those are names that will, I'm sure, be continuing to talk about on this program in the months to come as we get closer and closer to the high school football season for 2023. A reminder, if you're not watching this show right now on MiamiHerald.com or on YouTube, it's available as a pod, whatever podcatcher you like, Spotify, iTunes, you name it. If you got to listen to it in the car, if you just don't have access to watch it, or if you want to, just listen to it, it's available on that platform as well. But for this week, without further ado, let's get to my conversation with our good friend Fish as we break down the top defensive players around South Florida. And we're back for another segment with our buddy Charles Fishbein of Elite Scouting Services. Last week, he joined us and we talked a little bit about the top offensive players in both counties in South Florida overall. I see Fish has hit the transfer portal himself. He's now gone out to the Wild West for his background, just to change the theme up for our defensive player segment here. I mean, it is the Wild West these days anyway.
Can you imagine me in the Wild West, man? I think I would have got shot.
You probably would have. You would open your mouth quick in one of those saloons, and
I would have been Tombstone, and you're my Huckleberry.
It would have been done quick. Yeah. Sure. But anyway, but going over to like we were talking about, we're going to talk a little bit about the defensive side. And nobody has hit that portal, I think, as hard as Norland has this offseason. Maybe Central a little bit too. But that's going to be the war. And then if you look at Norland, I mean, I guess the question is, have they brought in enough to really make a difference on that side? It looks like they have one of the best front sevens in the entire area. I mean, we're bringing in the Lumen brothers from Jackson. Jermaine Carter comes over from Carroll City. Dimitri Nicholas is there as well. And you mentioned Jeremiah Marcel in the past before. Tell us a little bit about the Vikings. What, your thoughts on especially with the Lumen brothers, going to Rutgers as a package deal now.
Yeah, you know what? They have they've had a great recruiting class, Norland High School this year. Rivals and 247 have rated their class as one of the top classes in the country. So good job, Coach Heidelberg. Don't take it personal. You guys have a great recruiting class. You went out and got some reinforcements to go against that tough Miami Central football team, and championships
The
are
only way
one
they're
of
gonna have a chance.
Yeah, you win championships up front. And these guys are, that's, we've talked about it before. When you go back and you look at the history of high school football, that's how Miami Jackson a long time ago had a shot against Miami Northwestern with Lewis Gashlin and some of those guys up front. You win up front, and that's the one way that they can neutralize Miami Central's, most likely explosive offense that they're going to unleash on all these opponents down here this year. That'll give Norland a chance. Coach Heidelberg has a very good team. This is his best team he's had since Duke Johnson was there. And the only thing is they're going to have to get over that hump of that Miami Central. It's a pity that they don't have the classifications. Norland would definitely win a state championship this year if they weren't in there with Central. So they have their work cut out. They're going to listen. If Norland beats Central, you could argue that they are the national champions in the country, because that'd be a big win for their program.
Well, like you said, though, it's Central, but then Booker T's better. They got Jamori Flagg going to FSU. What do you think the Seminoles are getting with this kid? I mean, this kid's been good for a couple of years down here now.
Yeah, Jamori's a big physical kid. This is a kid that he was listed at 240, and he showed up at Florida State for one of their official visits, and they weighed him in, and he was pushing 300 pounds. So whatever he's been eating the last 6 months definitely changed him, going from a defensive end possibly to he's definitely moving inside and is going to be playing as an interior D lineman. He's a big physical kid. He's explosive off the ball. He's got the ability. He's really, his best trait is stopping the run. He's going to be a guy that I think he was a kid I watched last year against Blade Central, and I like the way he came off the ball, and he was constantly in the backfield. He's one of your typical South Florida kids, athletic and get in the backfield, and he creates havoc for that defense.
Another team, I mean, we talked about Norland a little bit, but what they're going to face at Central too. I mean, you lose Reuben Bain, but you have Ezekiel Marcelin still there, and then you bring in an Armando Blunt too. I mean, that front seven looks just as good or better than it was last year. I mean, what do you think of the Rockets on that side?
Yeah, they went out and they got some major reinforcements themselves. They brought in two brothers from California, and they have the Armando Blunt. This is a team that's loaded up front, big physical team. I think they're going to be very difficult to match up against, up front. D'Angelo Thompson's a defensive end they have. This is a team that can compete with anybody in the trenches. I really like what they have up there, and we talked about it with Norland. You're going to win championships with the line of scrimmage, and I don't think too many teams are better than Central up front.
Well, right away. I mean, the first game, Bishop Gorman, we saw how they up front they just killed Chaminade last year. So I mean, they're going to have to be if they're going to be able to slow that down in the first game, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, this game's a little different because it's at the beginning of the season. I think I wasn't out in Vegas when they played them. I think a lot of that too has to do with Chaminade just came off a state championship, and I don't know how many of those guys really played or cared about. Their season was over, and I'm not knocking. But I think this game's a little different. Central's going out there with a purpose. They're playing for a national championship, and they want to make a statement. I think it's going to be a totally different game for Miami Central than it was for Chaminade.
Well, let me ask you about Columbus, too, because they've had good defenses in the past. But in terms of a front four, maybe even a front seven, this could be one of the most talented that they've ever had now with Dylan Stevenson, with Dalen Russell. We're bringing in a Willis McGahee on top of that. Nebraska commit now, Willis McGahee. I mean, Columbus. We always think Central and some of these teams as we go into the next season and you're almost like, all right, by default they're the favorite. This is the first time that I feel like Columbus goes in and they're not just a contender, but the favorite to repeat. Like we're already thinking of them in that. You know what I'm trying to say? Like in that echelon with a Central, with an Aquinas, as far as them potentially winning that class. I think a lot of it has to do with that group.
You've seen a progression with all these programs. It took Northwestern a while to win their state championships. They won them. They didn't stop winning them. Miami Central is now on a tremendous run. This is a program that couldn't win state championships. St. Thomas, when I first got in, it was sketchy if they'd win. They weren't winning state championships every year. These programs now, it's just another thing that's expected every year. I think Columbus is starting to. They've won 2 now. They played for another. They got over that hump. It was a big thing, and I always thought they were very well coached under Coach Merritt. But it was just, you need a little push, a little and a little luck too. But once they get that taste in their mouth and the program understands the expectations, it's easier once you get that first one. I think Columbus has gotten over that hump. They've now been in the conversation for the last 4 or 5 years. They're the favorites in their classification. I mean, you've got a Palmetto that's got a lot of talent. Again, you've got a Western, but they've done it. Those programs have to do it. Palmetto had one of their best teams in the history, and they didn't get it done. It's so hard to get that first one. Once you get it, it's easier. Columbus has done it. The coach over there has done a phenomenal job of carrying on what Coach Merritt did. And, I don't see them getting slowed down. I mean, they've got a very good quarterback. They've got a tight end that's under the radar. He's, a big physical tight end they got. They got very good receivers and running backs. They're very good on defense. And they're bringing in guys like the Dylan Stevenson kid. You got Dalen Russell, these guys up front they wreak havoc. You watch what Dylan did last year in the playoff run. He basically willed their team at points of the season. This is a defensive player to those wins, whether it was in the playoffs or whatever. These guys have that taste in their mouth. And now when they bring guys in, those kids just understand, hey, this is how it's done and nothing less. This is what we expect once you come to Columbus. Before, it was like, you always saw it. They'd play a Northwestern or a Central, and it's like, oh boy, this thing's, and they got deflated. This team now has the same confidence as some of those other teams that have won, and it's expectations now. It's, hey, we're going to go play for a championship.
Yeah, the fear is gone for sure, because that used to be like they'd see the other team get off the bus, and it was like, leaving stains on the field.
Hey, but we saw that with Central. You saw it with, Northwestern for a long time. Northwestern always had talent. It was getting over that hump of winning state championships. You'd see them play a better program, like these teams would win, but they go to play a St. Thomas that was a perennial power, and they get blown out. That gap's closed because they've gone. These teams travel now. They leave the state. They go and play these other teams that are supposedly the best of the best, and they go and beat them up. And these teams have listen. When you have Central, all right, a team like Central, and kids from Texas and California are now rolling in, they're at a different level. They've become almost like a private school.
Yeah.
So when you see dorms popping up at Miami Central in about 6 months.
Yeah,
it's over. It really is over.
No, but in all seriousness, they really have, because we've seen Aquinas become a national brand, and now Central has become a national brand themselves, and it's impressive in a decade that they've been able to pull that off. But who do you think in Broward has maybe the most intimidating front seven? Do you think? I mean, I know Aquinas, I'm sure, has, but anybody else that maybe as well?
There's not a you're always going to look at Chaminade and you're going to look at Heritage. They're going to have good defensive lines. I think the guys at Western's going to have a pretty good D line. There's not a ton of guys up front on the D line that you look at and you're like, all right, there's no Bosa's, or there's no Bosa brothers or those type of guys. Just a lot of more second tier type players, and it's not a knock. It's just it's kind of, it goes through these trends. It happens where you'll have some dips in talent on the defensive lines, and those are the teams that win championships if they can find them. So, but I don't think anything's like Central or Norland. I could tell you that right now.
Yeah,
even Columbus. I think Columbus with Dalen and Dylan Stevenson. I don't think anybody's got 2 guys at Broward that are that good.
A couple of linebackers I wanted to ask you about in Broward, actually. What do you think of this kid at Fort Lauderdale, Remington Roberts, an FAU commit?
I mean, if you meet the kid in person, he's physically an impressive looking kid. you're like, wait a second. I remember going over there and meeting Coach Dunbar, and I'm like, wait a second. He's the first kid I met twice. He's the guy that gets me from the office back to Coach Dunbar's office every time I go to that school. He's just signed to me. So that tells you, like, they want the biggest guy in the school to make sure I don't do any stupid things on the way to the coach's office. So they have Remington. But he's a good-looking kid, good-looking player. This is the type of kid that, can play at a Power 5 school. And these guys, Coach Dunbar sent a kid a couple seasons ago, a wide receiver from his school over there, and the kid ended up getting recruited up. I don't see anything different. I think Remington's one of those guys. He's going to the minor leagues. And FAU's, we were there yesterday. They're doing a great job, but they're basically going to be developing this kid for some Power 5 school in 2 years, because I think he's one of those kids that's going to end up, I feel bad, but he'll transfer out in 2 years to an SEC or an ACC school because he's a good one. I think they got a very good player.
Shamar Makel over at Miramar. And Miramar overall, what do you think of them coming back?
I think he's the most – I put him as one of my spring risers. He's one of those guys. Like, Miramar does this. We talk about it all the time. It's one of those programs that is sneaky good. They always have kids coming through that program. He's one of them. He's one of those guys you see go to a West Virginia, a Kansas State, ends up an all-conference player, leads the team in sacks, and everybody's like, another one of those, hey, how did this guy do this?
Let's go to the secondary now. I'm going to talk the kid that you mentioned briefly in last week's segment was Jamari Howard, who was at Westland, and now he's at Central. Kid who had an Alabama offer not that long ago, and I mean, we didn't get to see a lot of him at Westland, but how did this kid project the next level for you?
I mean, here's a kid that was committed to Michigan State earlier, and I had a chance to talk to him or speak with him yesterday at the FAU camp. He's very impressive physically. He's, in that Mike Rump mold of a corner. I think or a Antrell Roll. He's a combo. He can play corner, probably going to project more as a safety as he moves up to college and potentially the NFL. He's a big, long kid. Produced at a high level at Westland. I think when you look at who recruited him, he was committed to Michigan State. Mel Tucker, I think two of the guys that are really good at developing corners is Mel Tucker at Michigan State and also Mark Stoops at Kentucky. When those guys offer you, that kid's good. They just have you trust their evaluations on defensive backs. Jabari, I think if he had played at a Northwestern or a Central early on, you're talking a kid that probably is a top 10 player, not only in Florida, but a nationally rated defensive back that everybody's talking about. He's been at a program in Westland that they did a good job at developing him. He stayed there for 3 years, which is 3 years more than you would ever think a kid like that would stay at a program like that. But Westland did a good job at developing him, and now he's ready for the major leagues. He was in the minors, and now he's in the majors. So he's right. He got called up. Central called him up. Their DBs left last year, and they called one of their affiliates and said, "Hey, man, we need you to come up and play for the big."
We're laughing, but it's not. But it's true. It's so sad that it's what it's become.
That's
Triple A Westland.
I think there's like a gentleman agreement with these schools. Listen, we'll let them listen. They could play for you guys for like 2 years. You guys could win some ball games, but understand that by their senior year, we're calling them up, man. If they're still playing you by their senior year, the kid ain't any good. So
that's the draft plan right there.
Yeah.
That's
G League.
Speaking, G League, exactly. Speaking of the major players, those major leagues, a kid I like a lot. I saw him last year because not just as a safety, but on special teams, this kid can block kicks, can make a lot of big plays. Is Zaquan Patterson at Chaminade. I mean, to me, yeah.
I mean, physically, he's one of those kids. When you meet him, you're like, all right. We always talk about those guys. You go to a school. When you go to a school and you have to ask somebody who the star player is or who that guy is, you're looking at the wrong kid. Zaquan's one of those kids. He stood out since his freshman year. Physically, he's big. He's probably going to grow into a linebacker, is my guess. He's one of those guys. He's a big physical kid. He can run. He can hit. He has all the physical traits you want in a big-time safety. I think he could be an in-the-box safety, especially with the way these teams, too, they play the spread offenses all the time. He can play back in coverage, but he can also come up and help you in run support. So he's one of those guys that's almost a unicorn these days because there's not a lot of those guys that could do both. And when you can find them, those are the guys that are going to be heavily recruited, and Zaquan is one of those players.
One guy that's on a Broward school that I don't think we've mentioned them at all so far, but they had a good year last year at corner. What do you think of not just this kid, but Haja Miller at Coconut Creek, Toledo commit, but Coconut Creek overall? I mean, they always seem to have a couple players here and there that are on the level where they could probably play anywhere. But what do you think of Creek coming into the season?
Yeah, I mean, they were a program that yesterday they're over at FAU, and they had a couple kids really stand out. They have one kid that stood out a lot. I thought a defensive lineman. Let me just get his name real quick for you. Haja Miller was a kid that I really, really liked. You just brought him up. He's a corner safety kid. He was at Dillard for a moment. The guy that really stood out was Elijah Cannon yesterday. He's a 6'1", 170-pound corner out of Coconut Creek. He's a guy that I really think Miami's, the Florida States, the Floridas, the SEC schools are really going to take a look at. And the kid that really stood out, and I went and watched his highlight film last night, is Demaine Wilson. He's listed as an outside linebacker. I think he's one of these defensive end outside pass rushers. You go watch his film. He's very explosive. He had a very good performance. He's a wide body kid. When you look at him, he's only 225, 230 right now, but he's a guy that I think could get into that 265, 270 range, maybe even get up to 290 if that's where you want him. If you want him to stay an edge rusher, as a defensive end, he could be 275, but I think he's the guy, is the sleeper of the team along with the other corner that I had mentioned earlier. So yeah. Elijah Cannon.
Yeah. Booker team, we were talking up front with Flag, but they might have one of the best secondaries overall, and Ben Hanks is at the heart of that. You know, just what impressed you about him in these last few months? We've seen him play before, but this kid getting better and better.
Yeah, I mean, I saw him first as a ninth grader over at Doral Academy. I remember talking about to Marcelo Rodriguez about him. He's one of the better DBs he's coached, and he's coached a lot of good ones, whether he was at Chaminade, whether he was at Doral. Mm-hmm. Ben's a big time player. He's going to be their guy. He's going to be in Alabama, Georgia. Everybody in the country is going to be after him because he's a shutdown corner. He can shut down half the field. He's got very good technique. And listen, he grew up we talked about all these guys that have come up in the football family, from the Sertains to the Porters to all these guys. Their kids, football-wise, whether it was Devin Bush's kid, the one thing is their football IQ is a lot greater than other guys that are playing on these teams. And you've seen it with Ben Hanks' kid. He knows what he's doing on that football field. You never see him get lost on film, or whether you see him at a practice. He knows what his job is. He knows when to if a guy's coming across and they're playing zone, he knows when that guy leaves his zone that he trusts the other guys in the secondary. He doesn't try to overcompensate, get himself out of position, and then get burned. He's got all the tools. He's got great feet. He's got great length. He can transition. He can move in any direction you want. And he's what colleges are looking for in a corner.
Definitely. Another one too. I mean, a couple of the other ones that we were talking about, like Aquinas is secondary. You know, Ryan Mack, picks up right where King Mack left off there, and Alan Bryant, a Pitt commit too. I mean, we're Earl Culp too, another kid. I mean, they're just
the Alan Bryant kid. I watched him. This is why Pitt and Charlie Partridge. Honestly, I can't give him enough praise, and I saw him yesterday. I still don't understand. The Florida school should find a position for him because he's so darn good at evaluating. You look at him pulling in a Kalijah Cansey, who ended up in the first round. Bryant was at their camp, very fluid, big, long. You want guys that are, the bigger they get, they become less fluid, become less athletic a lot of times. when you find these bigger corners that can turn or run and they could do those things, they're potential NFL guys. The guys that are 6'1", 6'2", and he continues to find these guys down here. He performed very well. Culp was a kid, I believe, was a wide receiver at one point of his career. St. Thomas has a very good secondary. These guys are all big, long, athletic guys. I really like the Mac kid. I think he's improved probably the most of any of those guys since last year to this year. Was at the Rivals camp, was very impressive. He was one of the better performers there, and he's continued it throughout the whole spring football. I think I went to at least 2 St. Thomas practices. He is very impressive in those practices.
Well, there you have it. That's a comprehensive rundown of the top defensive players in South Florida. I'm sure, obviously we're never going to be able to cover all of them in a show. We'd need like 3 hours or more to do that with so much talent out there. Anyone that maybe breaks out in your mind that we haven't mentioned already? It's someone that, like, one of those hidden gem types.
I'm sure there's a kid, Kareem Williams, I believe, at Ely High School. I think that's his name. He's a kid that.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned Ely yet, so they're definitely. Yeah,
I definitely think he's one of those guys. His Marcel Williams, wide receiver, corner. Sorry about that. He's one of those guys that I think can come out of the woodwork and be one of those guys that has a very good season. You see it all the time down here. There's always going to be 1 or 2 guys that have breakout seasons. That's what makes South Florida so special. So a lot of these guys don't get their opportunities till their senior year, and they have these great seasons, and people start recruiting them, and you're like, where'd this kid come from? But Marcel Williams out of Ely, I think, is one of those guys. He's a Boynton Beach kid that transferred to Ely this year, and I think he'll be a very good player.
Definitely, and we'll continue to have some of these over the course of the summer, and probably once we get closer to the football season. But Fish, as always, my friend, thank you so much for all the knowledge, and we appreciate you being here. Whether it's in some Spanish village or in the Wild West, we'll be out in the figuratively speaking, we'll be out in the Wild West of Dade and Broward County.
At least I'm breathing. That's all that matters. I'm still breathing.
There you go. There you go.
All right.
Thanks, buddy.
Easy. Bye.
Appreciate it. All right, so Fish always with a plethora of good information. Fish, I always appreciate his perspective. He goes out and he sees these guys, gets perspective from a lot of college coaches and really dives in, gives us a lot of good analysis. So we this week and last week, we appreciate Charles Fishbein for taking the time to do this with us. By the way, shout out not only to him but to Larry Bluestein for also being a great guest on this show and really giving us a lot of insights. And for those of you that like to attend these camps or to see some of these talent, if you're a coach out there that has a kid that hasn't been recognized, by the way, both Larry and Fish are going to be hosting a camp at Cardinal Gibbons this coming weekend on Saturday. Their Elite Scouting Services camp going to be out there at Fishbein, leading the way there. If you have a kid that hasn't been recognized, that's always a great place to get exposure for high school athletes as well. So check out the camp this weekend coming up at Cardinal Gibbons. And we'll be back before you know it. We'll be back and talking a little more about the high school sports season throughout the summer. May not be coming every single week, but we'll have episodes occasionally talking about the upcoming season and accomplishments from other players. We want to recognize and salute a lot of the state champions from this past season. Again, if you haven't seen already, we have already begun releasing our all-county teams. We'll have baseball and softball coming this week to wrap the spring sports season. They're available at miamiherald.com. Check that out. And then next week, we'll be announcing our end of the year awards, which include Athletes of the Year, Coaches of the Year, of course, our Leo Suarez, Walter Creech Courage Awards, and our Lifetime Achievement Awards to recognizing remarkable individuals in both Dade and Broward counties. So until then, we'll see you guys soon. I'm Andre Fernandez, Deputy Sports Editor at the Herald. Thanks for watching, as always, Titletown South Florida, brought to you by the Orange Bowl. Titletown South Florida, brought to you by Orange Bowl. Since 1935, Orange Bowl's service and commitment to South Florida has been as diverse as the residents that live here. Over the past 2 decades, Orange Bowl and its partners have committed more than $40 million to improving the South Florida community through its Orange Bowl Cares initiative. To learn more, visit orangebowl.org.